Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, saluting Earth Day on April 22nd with an ongoing commitment to help offset carbon emissions with sustainable harvesting of Missouri forests. Details at choosewood.com.
Welcome to St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jeremy Goodwin. Tussles over abortion rights in Missouri are nothing new. For historical perspective, we have longtime St. Louis Public Radio political reporter and, as of March, St. Louis Media Hall of Fame member Joe Mannies. I talked with Joe yesterday and noted that the drama last week over the future of the Planned Parenthood location in St. Louis drew national attention. But I mentioned to Joe it's not the first time Missouri has been near the center of the national debate over abortion rights.
Not at all. In fact, in the 1980s, I want to skip around a little bit, but in the 1980s, there was a number of court cases that originated in Missouri. This is, again, when the Republicans were in control of most of the statewide offices, and Bill Webster was the Missouri Attorney General and looking at running for governor, and he was a very staunch social conservative, and there were several cases that ended up before the U.S. Supreme Court, including one, Webster versus Reproductive Health Services, which basically set the stage for most of the statewide regulations around the country, as far as the Supreme Court ruling gave the states, or at least from the conservative perspective, more power in trying to regulate or curb abortion activities or abortion rights in those states. And this suit was filed less than a decade, around a decade after the original Supreme Court ruling, Roe v. Wade, in 1973.
So what is it about Missouri that makes it this kind of a battleground on this particular issue?
Well, it's kind of fascinating. Missouri has long been a socially conservative state. In fact, in the 1980s, what I just mentioned, the Democrats were in control of the General Assembly back then. And rural Democrats were just as socially conservative as rural Republicans back then. And so for decades, abortion in the state was more of a geographic or religious issue than a partisan issue. So it wasn't unusual to have Republicans and Democrats on both sides.
Oh, that's interesting.
Because you used to have suburban Republicans who, in the General Assembly, who were a bit more flexible when it came to abortion rights. And now there's virtually no suburban Republicans in the General Assembly. There's a few, but there's also virtually no rural Democrats in the state. And so now it's become coupled with what started out as an issue that centered on religion and when does life begin and various debates over that. It became then caught up in the partisan debate on a number of issues, many of them social, that have split not just on political lines, but on geographical lines.
So broadly speaking, nationally, we think of abortion rights debates as a highly partisan situation. In Missouri, you really have to look a little closer for those opinion fissures and where people are divided.
Yeah, especially when you go back a few decades. I mean, what's intriguing is that before Roe v. Wade, there were some pastors and religious activists in the urban areas who had been helpful for women who needed abortions, helping to. It was sort of getting these women to states like New York, which already had some form of abortion rights. So there was transportation and things like that were done in the 60s to help out some women. And again, this started in some more progressive churches in the 60s.
Before Roe v. Wade, do
Yes.
you know offhand how far one had to go from Missouri to get a safe legal abortion?
Well, to get a safe legal abortion, for the most part, you had to go to New York.
Wow.
The state of New York was one of the few states that had some sort of abortion rights back in the 60s. And again, it wasn't blanket, but the point was that you could often find someone. Now, in St. Louis, as in many urban areas, there was the whole, illicit abortion providers, people who were physicians or not, who would provide illegal abortions. but those often did not have great outcomes as far as health for the women. And so that's one of the issues that sort of propelled the Roe v. Wade decision in 1973 in the first place, is that there had been some cases, and it wasn't just about abortion, but the point was there was a number of high-profile cases dealing with women who were trying to end their pregnancies for various reasons. There was this huge international controversy over a drug called thalidomide, which had been given to women early in pregnancy, supposedly to help morning sickness, and it turned out that it did horrible things to the fetus. And so you had women who were trying to get abortions when they found out that they had taken this, and that they were seeing that some babies were being born with very serious,
horrible birth defects.
Yeah, horrible birth defects if they lived. And so there was a high-profile case of a woman who went overseas to get an abortion, and there was she was being charged here. I mean, in the United States. But I'm just mentioning that as the backdrop. So that when Roe v. Wade was decided, there was all this stuff going on. I mean, I was in college when Roe v. Wade came down. And it only had been in the middle 60s. People forget when birth control was legal. So Roe v. Wade came not that long after the courts had ruled that it was legal for women, including unmarried women, to get birth control. So this was all part of this movement at the time. And you had, though, a number of social conservatives, some of whom were not keen on birth control, and that's kind of come back again, but also who were just concerned about where they thought things were going, where they thought things were going too far. Missouri was actually one of the hotbed for some of the big demonstrations, some of the big protests back in the late 70s and early 80s. We used to have huge ones. And in fact, Anne Wagner's mother-in-law, Loretta Wagner, who has since died, but Loretta was a major national and regional player on the abortion issue. I would say that her status was similar to Phyllis Schlafly, but Loretto, who was a devout Catholic, it was about the abortion issue. And she led a number of major protests, efforts in the General Assembly. Again, it was bipartisan, and the Catholic Church was helping her. So there was this whole push that started with, wasn't just Catholics, it was also evangelicals, but in Missouri has a large Catholic population. So again, this started out as a religious debate.
Yeah, well, as you mentioned,
primarily
evangelical Christians have played a huge role in the conservative movement, of course, over the past several decades.
Yes.
And as you mentioned, in Missouri, we, of course, also have a lot of politically conservative Catholics. What do they find common ground politically, those two groups?
Well, I think on this issue they do. On some of the other issues, they don't. I mean, because Catholics, as the church is against the death penalty. I mean, there's some other things where evangelicals separate from that. But I was in the Post-Dispatch Washington Bureau in the early 80s and covered annually the big abortion march, National Abortion March in Washington, because Missouri and Southern Illinois had such huge contingents. And at that time, Missouri had two senators, John Danforth and Tom Eagleton, a Republican and a Democrat, and they were both against abortion, even though they were on different sides on other issues. And they used to hold these joint meetings with the marchers from Missouri. They would have like this town hall in one of the Senate office buildings or something. It'd be huge, packed. And so it was the climate was different. As far as, what I'm saying is it was not a partisan issue. People and there were people on both sides who either supported reproductive rights or who did not, and often for religious reasons. I mean, Tom Eagleton was liberal on many issues, but not on abortion. And
you mentioned you've seen maybe the erasure of the rural urban split.
Yes.
On this issue, or at least.
Yeah, I think what's happened. There's a couple things that have happened. One is that. We're talking 46 years ago now, since the decision, Roe v. Wade. Since then, birth control has become much more accessible, and now some of the opponents of abortion are meshing the two together, because some opponents of abortion are also against some or all forms of birth control. And if you remember, a few years ago, there was also a big debate of the morning after pill. That's what it's dubbed, Plan B, which now you can get over the counter, but you didn't used to. And whether or not that prevented a pregnancy from starting or was something that halted a pregnancy. And there's still that debate going on, which is one of the reasons that you've got some social conservatives who were pushing in the Missouri bill to limit it to abortions to 8 weeks. That's before many women know they're pregnant, but
and that's still, I think, 4 weeks before, in medical terms, before the embryo is considered to even be a fetus.
Correct. And but there's a strong belief about that. But it's also you've got a number of the social conservatives who are pushing on this bill, who also, as again, oppose some forms of birth control, like IUDs and others in particular. So this is.
Does that objection come strictly from on religious grounds?
Well, those who oppose abortion, many of them believe that IUDs, because IUD prevents an implantation of a fertilized egg, and so they see that as a early abortion.
Okay.
I'm boiling it down, but yeah. So that's and this debate, let's say in the 1990s, when Mel Carnahan was governor, who was a rural Democrat, but he was very big on abortion rights, and actually he set up a pretty expansive pregnancy planning program. I mean, in the state, from the standpoint that you could get family planning, the state was helping give some money to Planned Parenthood to provide birth control. He was trying to do things to curb the number of abortions by making birth control more accessible. Well, that became a huge, huge debate that went on for years in the General Assembly. And again, this was when the General Assembly was still run by Democrats, although it was narrowly. But you had a number of socially conservative or religious Democrats in the General Assembly who were opposed to it. So they ended up, the bottom line was, soon after he died, that program was ended. The General Assembly had hired lawyers to help fight the family planning program, because they saw it as giving money to Planned Parenthood, which they said supplemented what Planned Parenthood spent on abortions. Planned Parenthood said that was not true. But my point being is that this is the kind of fight that was high profile, went on for years, and this was over 20 years before our current state. So Missouri, it's often been normal for the last month of the General Assembly, every session, to revolve around some sort of abortion bill.
Joe, the last thing I'll ask you, and from the perspective you have covering this issue over the years, where are we in that battle between these two sides? Is the foes of abortion rights in a particularly strong position now from what you've seen before, or do you feel like we've been here before and it's just a cycle?
Well, it's going to depend. I think there's a couple things going on. One of it is generational. I think that you're seeing, even in rural parts of the state, again, young people, young women who are getting birth control, and they're rural too. And so they look at this issue different than the way their parents did. And I'm not saying they necessarily automatically support abortion rights, but they're looking at this issue with a little more nuance than their parents. And we're talking about
they've
rural
also grown
Missouri.
up in a world where birth control is available and affordable.
I mean, if you look at the 2012 Senate race, Claire McCaskill used the abortion issue as a hammer against Todd Akin and ended up winning by about 15 points. And that was at a time when the Republican nominee for president, Mitt Romney, carried the state by almost 10 points. So you had a number, well over 100,000 people who voted for Mitt Romney and voted for Claire McCaskill. And the perception was it was totally on the abortion issue. Now, this last time, even though now U.S. Senator Josh Hawley opposed abortion, it wasn't as big of an issue in the contest. But my point being that I think that it's become more nuanced in the state, and the fact that you've got one of the top Republican donors, David Humphreys, who's come out against the 8-week abortion ban. Now, he hasn't said anything about this other fight, but that I think is interesting is that you've got a donor who gives a lot of money to these Republicans who are now just back this bill and who are pressing a particular point of view, and that just shows some of the nuance, because he's saying it needs to at least have exceptions for rape and incest. So
that's sort of the new frontier for anti-abortion rights activists.
Right. Well, many have always believed that. I mean, I've been covering this issue for, like I said, 40 years. And nationally and in the state, there was often anti-abortion activists who made it clear that they were even opposing it for rape and incest, but they were not pressing it as much because they were just trying to make gains in getting abortion restrictions passed. Now it's full blown. I mean, their belief is that a fetus is a fetus, and regardless of how it became a fetus, it deserves protections. And so that's why they're going after. They want to prevent it against rape, incest, in many cases, fetal anomalies or Down syndrome, other things that even 10 years ago they weren't mentioning in their fight over abortion rights. So that's how it's become, I think, much more all or nothing on both sides. And you're seeing this. And you're seeing this in the presidential race. But particularly in Missouri, it's going to be interesting to see if this plays out at all in the governor's race.
That's longtime political reporter Joe Mannies. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio 90.7 KWMU.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, saluting Earth Day on April 22nd with an ongoing commitment to help offset carbon emissions with sustainable harvesting of Missouri forests. Details at choosewood.com.